I fell in love with my neighbor's housekeeper. She was my secret, my entire world. When she was falsely accused of theft, I was the only person who could save her. One word was all it would take. But when the police asked me what I saw, I chose my perfect life over hers. The morning in our neighborhood always smelled of freshly mown grass and money. Automated sprinklers silently irrigated the perfect lawns, their arcs of water catching the early sun like 1,000 tiny diamonds. The only sound to disturb the programmed tranquility was the distant, industrious hum of a leaf blower, tidying a world that was already immaculate. I sat on the terrace, a cup of long cold tea in my hands, watching as Mark, my husband, gave his final, crisp instructions to the gardener, his suit of flawless armor against the day. Our life was as meticulously calibrated as the lines of the boxwood hedge that separated our property from the neighbors. Everything was correct, predictable, and utterly airless. My gaze drifted to the house next door, a mirror image of our own architectural perfection. There, kneeling by a bed of fiercely red roses, was their housekeeper. I didn't know her name, but I often watched her as she worked, a silent observer of her quiet competence. There was a focused grace in her movements, a strength in the set of her shoulders that was entirely absent from my own fragile, carefully sheltered world. She moved with a purpose that seemed to come from within, not from a list of duties handed to her by someone else. She was a point of solid reality in my landscape of beautiful illusions. Today, for the first time, she lifted her head and our eyes met across the manicured expanse of green. She did not look away. She did not offer the brief, subservient smile our own gardener gave me when our paths crossed. She simply held my gaze, her expression calm and direct, as if she were seeing not the lady of the adjacent manor, but simply another woman. It was a look of uncomplicated equality, and it felt more startling than an outright transgression. In that moment, a thin gold chain, a birthday gift from Mark, slipped from my neck, its small diamond pendant disappearing silently into the thick turf at the edge of the terrace. I let out a soft, involuntary sigh of frustration. The necklace was insignificant in value but heavy with the symbolism of our life, a delicate, beautiful thing I was meant to wear and not to lose. I knew with a sinking certainty that I would never find it by myself in the dense, perfect grass. Across the hedge, the woman rose to her feet, brushing the dark, rich soil from the knees of her work pants. Without a word, she walked to the low hedge, stepped over it as if it were not a boundary at all, and moved onto my lawn with an unhesitating stride. She took a few steps, her eyes scanning the ground with an intensity that I, in my comfortable detachment, could never muster. She tilted her head slightly, squinting against the sun, and then bent down in one fluid motion. A moment later, she was standing before me, holding out her open palm. There, nestled in the lines of her hand, was my necklace, sparkling as if it were relieved to be found. Her fingers were warm and calloused from her work when they brushed against mine as I took it from her. The contact was like a tiny jolt of static electricity, a brief, unexpected current that disrupted the smooth, placid surface of my day. Her name was Simone. Our conversations began across the formal green boundary of the boxwood hedge, a barrier that seemed to define not just our properties, but our stations in life. At first, the topics were as manicured as the lawns around us, the unseasonable warmth for October, the stubborn persistence of aphids on the Hendersons' prize-winning roses. Yet even in these sterile subjects, her voice was a revelation. It was low and calm, with a texture that seemed to hold stories I couldn't yet imagine. These brief exchanges became my oxygen, a small, vital pocket of air in the suffocating, vacuum-sealed atmosphere of my home. Soon, the polite chatter about horticulture deepened, flowing into the spaces left empty by my life. Simone spoke little about herself, but she possessed an extraordinary capacity for listening, a stillness that invited confession. In her presence, I felt the suffocating costume of Mrs. Mark Evans begin to loosen. I didn't have to perform. I found myself telling her about the books I was reading, characters whose fictional lives felt more authentic than my own. I confessed my loathing for the glittering, hollow dinner parties Mark insisted we attend, the way the laughter and champagne left a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. I spoke of the emptiness, a quiet, creeping void that had become my most constant companion. It was a feeling I had once tried to explain to Mark, who had diagnosed my ennui as a symptom of idleness, prescribing a new charity committee or a tennis lesson as the cure. Simone offered no such prescriptions. She never judged, never offered the easy, empty platitudes other women did. She would simply nod, her dark, thoughtful eyes holding mine, and in their depths, I saw not pity, but a profound and unnerving understanding. Mark saw a problem to be solved, Simone saw a pain to be witnessed. My days began to revolve around the possibility of these encounters. I started inventing reasons to be outside during the hours she was working in the adjacent garden. I would prune our already perfect roses, my hands clumsy in the thick leather gloves, my focus entirely on the figure moving with such quiet purpose on the other side of the hedge. On the hottest days, I would carry a tall, sweating glass of iced lemonade to her, the condensation cold against my palm. The first time, I felt a tremor of anxiety, a fear of crossing some invisible but powerful line. She accepted these small offerings with a simple, solemn dignity that disarmed me completely. There was no trace of the deference I had come to expect from service staff, no fawning gratitude. She would thank me with a quiet that's kind, and meet my eyes as an equal, her gaze clear and steady. She took the glass as a friend would, not as a servant receiving a handout from the lady of the house. This quiet assertion of her own worth was more compelling than any overt act of rebellion. It made me feel that our connection, however fragile, was real. Our friendship became a secret garden, cultivated in the shadows of our prescribed roles. To the outside world, to Mark and the Hendersons and the other residents of our pristine enclave, nothing had changed. She remained the housekeeper, a functional, almost invisible part of the neighborhood's machinery. I remained the bored, elegant housewife with too much time on her hands. No one saw the way my entire being would lean towards the sound of her voice, the way a shared, fleeting smile across the lawn could illuminate my entire day. I began to live for these stolen moments. I would find myself watching the clock, waiting for the time she was scheduled to tend the outdoor plants. My heart would beat a little faster when I saw her car pull into the Hendersons' driveway. The quiet hum of my own home, once a symbol of peaceful order, now felt like a form of imprisonment, a silence I was desperate to escape. My carefully ordered life had been disrupted by the simple, human presence of a woman who saw me, truly saw me, for the first time in years. Our bond was fortified in these stolen minutes, built not just on words, but on the spaces between them. There were long, comfortable silences when we would simply work near each other, separated by the hedge, the quiet snipping of her shears a counterpoint to the rustle of the pages in my book. We learned each other's rhythms, the small sighs of fatigue, the moments of quiet contemplation. This unspoken intimacy felt more profound, more real, than any of the loud, performative conversations I had with my husband's associates. I started to notice details I had previously ignored. The specific way the late afternoon sun caught the silver streaks in her hair, the faint scent of lavender that clung to her clothes, the way she would sometimes hum a low, sad tune to herself when she thought no one was listening. My own senses felt sharper, more alive. The world, which had seemed so muted and gray, was slowly regaining its color, all because of these brief, forbidden windows of connection. She was teaching me how to pay attention again, not just to the world, but to the stirrings in my own heart. The secrecy was a constant, low-grade fever. It was both a source of thrilling energy and a wellspring of anxiety. I would orchestrate our conversations with the strategic precision of a military general, always aware of who might be watching, of the angle from a neighbor's window, of the sound of Mark's car returning unexpectedly up the driveway. The risk was an essential component of our bond. It was the pressure that turned the common carbon of our shared moments into something that felt as precious and hard as a diamond. I was becoming dependent on her, and the realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. She was more than a friend, she was my anchor, the one point of stability in the churning sea of my own quiet desperation. I found myself editing my own thoughts throughout the day, saving up observations and feelings to share with her across the hedge. Her quiet, steady presence was the mirror in which I was beginning to see my own reflection again, not as a wife or a hostess, but as a person. Our connection, nurtured in secret, was becoming the most essential part of my life. Mark left for a business trip that was scheduled to last for 3 full days. The sound of his car's engine, a low, expensive growl, faded down the long driveway, and as it vanished completely, the entire house seemed to exhale. It was a space that was always implicitly, powerfully his, saturated with his presence even when he was in another room. The air was calibrated to his preferred temperature, the silence was arranged around his potential for noise, the objects were placed according to his sense of order. With him gone, the house suddenly became a neutral territory, a vacuum. For the first time, it felt like it could be mine. I walked through the silent rooms, my bare feet silent on the cold marble floors. The house was a monument to his success, and I was its chief curator, tasked with maintaining its pristine, soulless perfection. I ran a hand over the back of his leather armchair in the study, a throne from which he conducted his conference calls, reshaping the world in small, profitable ways. It felt alien, the seat of a stranger. In our bedroom, his clothes hung in regimented lines, a platoon of gray and blue suits standing at attention. The sheer, oppressive order of it all made me feel like an intruder in my own life. As evening began to bleed across the sky, painting the manicured lawns in shades of lavender and bruised orange, the freedom of the empty house began to curdle into a profound, aching loneliness. The silence was no longer liberating, it was vast and accusing. I sat on the terrace, a glass of wine untouched beside me, and watched the lights flicker on in the Hendersons' house next door. I knew Simone's workday would be ending soon. I imagined her packing her bag, walking to her car, driving away to a life I couldn't picture, a life that was wholly her own. The thought of her leaving felt like a physical blow, a desertion. A desperate, irrational longing took hold of me, a current of energy that felt both alien and deeply familiar. It was a rebellion against the crushing inertia of my existence. I needed to do something, to break a rule, to disrupt the perfect, predictable algorithm of my life. The urge to see her, to speak to her outside the carefully circumscribed boundaries of our hedgeside chats, was overwhelming. My mind raced, searching for a plausible pretext, a key to unlock the door that stood between our separate worlds. The thought was madness. It was a reckless, foolish impulse that could unravel everything. I paced the kitchen, the cool stone a shock to my bare feet. What could I say? What reason could I possibly have for summoning the neighbor's housekeeper after hours? My life was a fortress of convenience, nothing ever broke, and if it did, there was a list of expensive, vetted professionals to call. The idea that came to me was flimsy, pathetic in its transparency, yet it was the only one I could grasp. The kitchen faucet. A leak. A strange noise. It was a lie a child would tell, clumsy and obvious. But my need was so great it bulldozed all sense of reason. The risk felt less significant than the crushing weight of another empty evening alone. My hands trembled as I picked up my phone, my heart a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. I found her number, the one she had given me weeks ago, in case of emergency, a phrase that now seemed grimly ironic. I typed the message, my thumb hovering over the screen, the words glowing in the dim light of the kitchen. My kitchen faucet seems to be broken. I was wondering if you could possibly take a look. Each letter felt like a betrayal of the quiet dignity of our friendship, reducing our connection to a crude, transactional lie. I pressed send before I could lose my nerve, the small swoosh of the message leaving an echoing silence in its wake. The 10 minutes that followed were the longest of my life. Time stretched and warped, each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall a hammer blow against my sanity. I was consumed by a tidal wave of regret and anxiety. What had I done? She would see through the lie instantly. She would be offended, perhaps even disgusted by my presumption. She would not come, and tomorrow, our fragile, secret friendship would be gone, replaced by an awkward, unbreachable silence. I found myself praying that she would ignore the message, that she would let my foolish impulse die unanswered in the digital ether. Then, the doorbell chimed. The sound, normally so gentle, ripped through the silence of the house like a gunshot. It was real. She was here. My entire body felt weightless, my blood turning to ice water. The short walk from the kitchen to the foyer felt like a journey across a vast, unforgiving desert. With a hand that felt disconnected from my own body, I reached out and opened the heavy oak door. And there she was, standing in the soft glow of the porch light, a silhouette against the encroaching darkness. My breath caught in my throat. She was not the woman from the garden. Dressed in a simple, dark t-shirt and worn-in jeans, she was Simone, a person untethered from her role. Without the practical, shapeless uniform, the lines of her body were different, her presence less defined by her function. She looked younger than I had realized, her hair pulled back from her face, revealing a vulnerability I had never seen in the bright light of day. She looked tired, but her eyes, when they met mine, were as clear and direct as always, holding a quiet, questioning gravity. "Eleanor," she said, my name in her voice a strange and beautiful sound. I stepped back, a silent invitation, and she crossed the threshold. The solid thud of the door closing behind her sealed us in, creating a new, shared reality inside the walls of my home. The air felt charged, thick with unspoken questions and possibilities. The house, which had felt so cavernous and empty just moments before, now seemed to shrink, its entire focus narrowed to the two of us standing in the marble-floored foyer. I led her towards the kitchen, my movements stiff and unnatural. I was acutely aware of her presence behind me, of the sound of her soft-soled shoes on the stone, a quiet counterpoint to the nervous click of my own. The kitchen, when we entered it, was aggressively pristine. The stainless steel appliances gleamed under the recessed lighting, the granite countertops were polished to a mirror shine. And in the center of it all, the faucet in question stood, a perfect sculpture of chrome, silent and utterly, undeniably functional. The absurdity of my lie was a third presence in the room with us. We stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching taut. I stared at the faucet, willing it to spring a leak, to make a noise, to do anything to vindicate my foolish, desperate gambit. But it remained perfect, a testament to Mark's insistence on only the best. I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. I had abused her kindness, treated her like a handyman I could summon at will, and for what? To ease a loneliness that was entirely my own privileged burden. "It isn't broken, is it?" she asked, her voice a low, soft murmur that cut through my spiraling thoughts. It was not an accusation. It was a gentle, knowing statement, a quiet dismissal of the lie to make room for the truth. Her gaze was not angry, but filled with a deep, patient curiosity. She was giving me a chance to abandon the pretense, to be honest. But the words would not come. My throat closed over them, the simple truth, I just wanted to see you, too naked, too vulnerable to speak aloud. I could only manage a small, jerky shake of my head. My silent confession hung in the air between us. It was an admission of my weakness, my loneliness, my need. It stripped me of all my social armor, of the role of Mrs. Evans, the lady of the house. I was just Eleanor, a woman drowning in a beautiful, empty life. I braced myself for her to turn and leave, for the quiet judgment, the polite withdrawal. Instead, she closed the small distance between us, her movements as calm and deliberate as when she tended the roses. The world seemed to shrink, to distill itself into the few feet of space that separated our bodies. She lifted a hand, and I flinched almost imperceptibly, a lifetime of conditioned distance making me recoil from this unexpected breach of protocol. But her touch, when it came, was impossibly gentle. Her fingers, calloused from work but surprisingly soft, rested against my cheek. The gesture was not possessive, not romantic, not anything I could easily categorize. It was an act of profound, startling tenderness, a quiet offering of comfort that asked for nothing in return. It was a gesture of pure, uncomplicated human connection. And with that single, gentle touch, the final dam inside me broke. The carefully constructed walls I had built around my heart, the years of polite smiles and buried feelings, all of it crumbled into dust. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path down my cheek, and she did not wipe it away. In that moment, the rigid, unspoken caste system that had defined our relationship was obliterated. I was no longer the mistress of the house, and she was no longer the housekeeper. We were simply two women, finding in each other a reflection of a deep and unspoken longing. I had spent years feeling like a ghost in my own life, an invisible curator of beautiful things. But in the quiet of my kitchen, under the warmth of her hand, I felt the startling, electric shock of being truly seen. The silence of the house was no longer a symbol of my isolation, it had transformed into a sanctuary, a protective vessel for this new, fragile, and sacred connection. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I was not afraid. I was not lonely. I was, quite simply, alive. Our affair was a mosaic, pieced together from stolen moments, each one a small, precious tile in a hidden, intricate design. It was built in the interstitial spaces of my rigidly scheduled life. Her short, breathless visits became the new focal point of my week, carefully engineered to coincide with Mark's predictable absences at the office or the golf course. The lie of a book club meeting or a charity luncheon became my passport to these brief, incandescent hours of authenticity. My life, once a single, monotonous track, had split into two parallel realities, one lived in the open, the other in the shadows. Our communication reverted to a kind of secret language, spoken across the still present but now irrelevant hedge. A quick, meaningful glance while I was retrieving the mail could convey a universe of longing. A shared smile as our paths crossed in the neighborhood was no longer a simple pleasantry, but a spark of shared conspiracy. We mastered the art of the accidental touch, a brush of fingers as I handed her a glass of water, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt of electricity through my entire system. Each of these small, clandestine acts was a risk, a gamble against the watchful eyes of our small, insular world, and the inherent danger made every moment sharper, more vivid, more real. My perfect, sterile house was transformed. It was no longer a museum curated by my husband, but our secret territory, a sanctuary where the suffocating rules of the outside world did not apply. The rooms, once silent and impersonal, now held the echoes of her laughter, the ghost of her presence. The faint, clean scent of her perfume, a simple, inexpensive lavender, would linger in the air long after she had gone, mingling with the heavy, cloying scent of the roses from the garden. That combined fragrance became the olfactory signature of our forbidden happiness, a scent I would breathe in deeply, trying to hold on to the feeling of her being near. I learned to live a double life with a skill that both surprised and frightened me. In the daylight hours, I was Mrs. Eleanor Evans, a flawless performance of wifely devotion and domestic grace. I planned menus, oversaw the household staff, and smiled serenely at Mark's side during his business dinners. I was a beautiful, functional object, an essential part of the architecture of his success. But in those rare, stolen hours we carved out for ourselves, I shed that suffocating identity. I was simply Eleanor, a woman rediscovering the contours of her own soul, a soul that had been dormant for so long. Simone, in her quiet wisdom, never asked for more than I could give. She never spoke of a future, never questioned the severe limitations of our situation. Her love was a thing of the present tense, a radical acceptance of the now that was both a comfort and a quiet heartbreak. She seemed to understand, without ever needing to be told, that our connection could only exist within the carefully constructed bubble of our secrecy. She taught me, through her example, to find a universe of meaning in a single, perfect moment, rather than yearning for a future that was an impossible dream. But the shadow of reality was a constant, silent observer. It was present in the sound of Mark's car pulling into the driveway, a sound that could send a jolt of pure, cold panic through me, forcing a hasty, whispered goodbye. It was there in the casual, intrusive questions from neighbors, the small talk that always felt like a potential interrogation. We were walking a tightrope, suspended high above the chasm of exposure, and while the view was breathtaking, the fear of falling was a constant companion. Every shared moment was a victory, but every victory was a reminder of the war we were silently, constantly fighting. The fragile peace of our secret world was shattered one Saturday evening. The Hendersons, our neighbors and Simone's employers, were hosting one of their annual garden parties. It was a command performance for the neighborhood, and Mark, ever conscious of social obligations, insisted we attend. The air was thick with the scent of grilled shrimp, expensive perfume, and the quiet, simmering resentments of the wealthy. I moved through the crowd with a practiced smile, my eyes constantly searching for Simone, who was circulating with a tray of champagne flutes, her face a mask of professional neutrality. Later in the evening, I found myself trapped in a conversational eddy near the roaring outdoor fireplace. Carol Henderson, a woman whose voice could curdle milk, was holding court, her face flushed with Chardonnay and indignation. She was complaining, in a loud, conspiratorial whisper that was intended to be overheard, about a piece of jewelry that had gone missing from her bedroom. It was an antique brooch, she explained, a family heirloom of immense sentimental, and, she made sure to add, financial, value. The implication was as thick and unpleasant as the cigar smoke hanging in the air. It must have been sometime last Tuesday, she declared, her eyes scanning the faces of her rapt audience. And you know, the only people who were in the house all day were the staff. She let the word staff hang in the air, freighted with suspicion. The gardener was outside, of course. But the help, she continued, lowering her voice to a dramatic, venomous stage whisper, she's in and out of the rooms all day. Who else could it have been? My blood ran cold. The casual, entitled cruelty of her accusation was like a physical blow. An icy dread clenched itself around my heart, so tight I could barely breathe. Last Tuesday. That was the day Mark had an all-day off-site meeting. It was the day Simone had spent 3 glorious, uninterrupted hours with me, in my house. My mind reeled, the carefully constructed walls of my secret life beginning to tremble. I felt a dozen pairs of eyes on me, on all of us, the silent, complicit audience to this ugly, unfolding drama. This was not just gossip, it was an execution, and I knew who the intended victim was. My gaze shot across the crowded patio, frantically searching for Simone. I found her near the French doors leading to the kitchen, collecting empty glasses. She was still wearing her professional mask, but as she straightened up, her eyes met mine across the space filled with laughing, oblivious people. In that single, shared glance, I saw her quiet composure falter. She saw the raw, naked fear on my face, and I saw the flicker of dawning horror in her eyes. The shadow of reality, which had always been a distant threat, had finally fallen over us, and its darkness was absolute. 2 days later, the Hendersons escalated their quiet war. They did not do it with the vulgarity of a public scene, but with the chilling, surgical precision of their class. They called the police. The summons came not in the form of a harsh knock on the door, but as a civilized telephone call from Carol Henderson herself, inviting Mark and me over for a cup of tea to clear up a small misunderstanding. The phrase was so laden with genteel menace that it made my blood run cold. Mark, oblivious to the undercurrents, saw it merely as a neighborly duty, a chance to show solidarity. For me, it felt like a walk to the gallows. We crossed the immaculate lawn that separated our properties, a pristine green carpet that now felt like a no-man's land between 2 opposing trenches. Mark walked with his usual confident stride, a man secure in his place in the world. I felt as though I were wading through deep water, each step a monumental effort. When the Hendersons opened their door, the pretense of social pleasantry was immediately dispensed with. The living room, usually a showcase of expensive, impersonal taste, had been transformed into an interrogation chamber. 2 uniformed police officers stood near the fireplace, their presence a brutal violation of the neighborhood's carefully maintained serenity. And in the center of the room, standing alone, was Simone. She was pale beneath her dark skin, but her back was ramrod straight, her chin held high. She was not dressed in her work uniform, but in a simple, neat dress, as if she were attending her own execution and was determined to do so with dignity. Our eyes met for a fleeting, desperate second, and in that glance, an entire universe of terror and shared history passed between us. Then Mark put a proprietary hand on the small of my back, guiding me towards the sofa, and the connection was broken. Mr. Henderson, a man whose bonhomie I now recognized as a thin veneer over a core of cold steel, was explaining the situation to the senior officer in a low, reasonable tone. He was careful to state that they were not pressing formal charges, not yet. They simply wanted to get to the bottom of things. The brooch, he reiterated, was a priceless family heirloom. It had vanished from his wife's jewelry box on Tuesday afternoon, a time when, he stated with damning certainty, the only person with access to the master suite was Simone. The accusation, though couched in the language of reluctant concern, was as clear and sharp as a shard of glass. My mind began to race, a frantic, panicked scramble for a solution. Tuesday. The day of Mark's off-site meeting. The day Simone had been with me, in my house, for nearly 2 glorious, sun-drenched hours. She had an alibi. I was her alibi. The realization was a sudden, dizzying wave of relief, followed immediately by a tsunami of pure, cold fear. To save her, I would have to speak. I would have to insert myself into their narrative, to create a crack in the smooth, perfect facade of my own life. The risks were immeasurable, the potential consequences catastrophic. The officer, a weary-looking man with tired eyes, turned his attention to me. His voice was polite, almost gentle, but his questions were like a series of carefully aimed projectiles. "Ma'am," he began, "you're the direct neighbor. Your properties are very close. Is there any chance you might have seen something unusual on Tuesday afternoon? Perhaps a car you didn't recognize, or someone entering or leaving the Hendersons' property?" The entire world seemed to shrink, to collapse into the suffocating confines of that overdecorated living room. Every person in the room was looking at me, their faces a blur of expectation. My gaze flew to Simone. She was already watching me, her dark eyes wide and unblinking. There was no pleading in her expression, no desperate appeal for help. There was something far more powerful, a quiet, unwavering expectation. She knew what I knew. She knew that I held her fate in my hands. She was trusting me, trusting the bond that we had forged in secret, to be her shield. All it would take was a single, simple sentence. Simone was with me. The words formed in my mind, a perfect, crystalline truth. I could say it. I could save her. I could invent a reason, a plausible lie to conceal the deeper truth. A plumbing issue, a fallen tree branch, a request for advice on my own wilting roses. Any of these would be enough to create reasonable doubt, to shatter the Hendersons' neat, convenient narrative of guilt. It would invite questions, of course. It would subject me to a level of scrutiny I had spent my entire adult life avoiding. Mark would be furious at my involvement in such a messy situation. The Hendersons would be insulted. But it would be enough. It would be enough to pull Simone back from the precipice. I opened my mouth to speak, the life-saving words balanced on the tip of my tongue. And then, I made the fatal mistake of looking at my husband. Mark was watching me, his expression a mixture of mild boredom and distaste. It was clear he considered this entire affair a vulgar inconvenience, a distasteful glimpse into the lives of the people who served them. His face held a kind of weary, patrician pity for Simone. He had already tried and convicted her in the court of his own unassailable judgment. She was the help, and the help was, by definition, suspect. In that instant, I saw my entire future laid out before me. I saw Mark's cold, angry questions. I saw the whispers, the knowing glances from the other wives in the neighborhood. I saw the intricate, beautiful architecture of my life, the life of security and privilege and effortless comfort, begin to crumble. I thought of my perfect home, my reputation, the sheer, crushing weight of the world I stood to lose. And I contrasted it with the world of a woman who had nothing, a woman whose only crime was to be poor and powerless in a room full of the rich and powerful. The choice was a razor's edge, a moment of perfect, terrible clarity. It was my life versus hers. My comfort versus her reputation. My fear versus her freedom. The silence in the room stretched for an eternity. The officer was still looking at me, his pen poised over his notepad, waiting. Simone's eyes were still locked on mine, her trust a physical weight on my soul. I took a shallow, ragged breath, the air in the room feeling thick and toxic, impossible to breathe. I turned my gaze from Simone, breaking our connection, and looked directly at the police officer. The words that came out of my mouth were not my own. They were the words of Mrs. Mark Evans, a woman I no longer knew, a stranger who had hijacked my voice to save herself. "No," I said, my voice a cool, steady, and monstrous lie. "I'm sorry. I didn't see a thing." The silence that followed my lie was not empty. It was a dense, heavy element that filled the Hendersons' living room, pressing down on all of us. Simone did not cry out, did not protest her innocence. She simply absorbed my betrayal with a stillness that was more damning than any accusation. She looked at me one last time, her gaze holding not hatred, but a profound and weary disappointment, as if she were seeing not a monster, but something far more pathetic, a coward. Then she turned her eyes away, and in that simple movement, she severed the bond between us forever. The spell was broken. I was Mrs. Evans again, and she was the help. Simone was dismissed that same afternoon. There was no severance, no letter of recommendation, just a quiet, clinical severance from the life she had known. A week later, from the upstairs window of my bedroom, I watched her load a few worn suitcases into the back of an old, unfamiliar car. She did not look at my house. She did not look at the Hendersons' house. She looked straight ahead, her face a mask of resolute control, before getting into the driver's seat and pulling away from the curb. I watched until her car was a tiny, insignificant speck that vanished at the end of our perfect, tree-lined street. Then she was gone. My life resumed its flawless, predictable rhythm. The automatic sprinklers came on at dawn, Mark left for the office at precisely 7:30, and the days unspooled in a long, unbroken thread of quiet, elegant emptiness. The house next door acquired a new housekeeper, a nervous, talkative woman I made a point to avoid. On the surface, everything was as it should be. The system had been preserved. But beneath the placid surface of my existence, a profound and irreversible change had occurred. The secret garden of my heart, the one place I had felt truly alive, had been razed to the ground, leaving behind a scorched and barren desert. About a month after Simone left, Carol Henderson approached me at a neighborhood gathering, a triumphant, self-satisfied smile on her face. She was wearing the infamous brooch. "You'll never guess where it was," she announced to a small group of us, her voice dripping with amusement. "It had fallen behind Michael's dresser. Can you imagine? All that fuss for nothing." She laughed, a high, brittle sound, and the other women joined in. There was no mention of Simone, no flicker of remorse, no apology. An entire human life had been casually ruined and then forgotten, a minor, inconvenient footnote in the grand, comfortable narrative of their own. The years that followed were a study in silence. I perfected the art of living on the surface, my movements and words as carefully arranged as the furniture in my home. I played the part of the perfect wife, the gracious hostess, the serene neighbor. But inside, the desert was expanding, consuming everything. The vibrant colors of the world seemed to fade, muted by the gray dust of my own cowardice. I would sometimes find myself standing at the window, staring at the hedge that separated the 2 yards, a physical monument to the choice I had made, a border between the life I had and the one I had thrown away. 20 years passed. The world changed, but my life remained a fixed, unchanging diorama. 5 years ago, Mark died of a sudden, massive heart attack on his beloved golf course, an abrupt and untidy end to a life dedicated to order. I was left alone in the vast, silent house, the sole inhabitant of a gilded cage. The silence was different now, deeper, more absolute. It was no longer a space defined by his absence, but a reflection of my own. The ghosts of my past were my only companions, and the loudest among them always had Simone's quiet, disappointed eyes. One sleepless night, fueled by a desperation I had long mistaken for simple curiosity, I made a decision. It was the first active, truly selfish thing I had done in 2 decades. I went to my computer and hired a private investigator, a discreet online service that promised results with no questions asked. I gave them Simone's full name, her approximate age, and the last known city of her employment. I didn't know what I was looking for. Absolution? A second chance? Or perhaps just a confirmation that she, too, was as broken and lonely as I was. The waiting that followed was a unique form of torture. The investigator's report arrived 2 weeks later in a plain, unmarked manila envelope. My hands trembled as I opened it, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The document was brief, clinical, a collection of facts that felt both mundane and world-altering. Simone Davis was living in Oregon. She had never married. She was a counselor at a residential facility for at-risk youth, a life of service, a life of meaning. She had built a world for herself out of the ashes of the one she had been forced to leave behind, a world dedicated to helping others who had been cast aside. But it was the final page of the report that shattered the last, brittle remnants of my composure. Attached was a scanned copy of a legal document, a certificate of adoption dated 15 years prior. Simone had adopted a 3-year-old girl from the foster care system. A daughter. My eyes swam, the black and white text blurring through a sudden, hot film of tears. I forced myself to focus, my gaze tracing the printed lines, the formal, bureaucratic language of a life being officially created. I found the line for the child's given name. The name on the certificate was Eleanor. The air left my lungs in a single, ragged gasp. It was not a tribute. It was not an act of forgiveness. It was a reclamation. She had taken my name, a name I had disgraced with my weakness, and she had given it to a child, a new life, a chance for it to be associated with something good and worthy and loved. It was the most profound and devastating act of grace I had ever witnessed, a quiet, unassailable judgment on the life I had chosen to live. It was an act that both absolved and condemned me in the same instant. Below the scanned document was a short, typewritten note from the investigator, the final nail in the coffin of my foolish, desperate hope. Upon contact, Ms. Davis was polite but firm, it read. She asked me to convey to my client that she has a good life, that she is happy, and that she has no desire for any future contact. I sat on my terrace, in the same chair where I had once watched her tend the roses, and held the single sheet of paper in my hand. I had received a pardon I did not deserve and a life sentence from which there would be no appeal. The bridge I had burned all those years ago, I realized with a final, soul-crushing clarity, had not led to a chasm, but to a different, better life. A life I had denied not just to her, but to myself.